The mess hall buzzed with the familiar sounds of clinking silverware and hushed conversations as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos moved between the tables, her combat boots silent against the polished floor. The officers' dining area at Fort Braxton was worlds apart from the enlisted mess. White tablecloths, actual china instead of metal trays, and an atmosphere thick with rank and privilege. Maria had been assigned to serve the evening meal to the visiting generals, a duty that made her stomach churn with each step. Colonel Harrison had made his intentions clear when he'd called her into his office 3 days earlier. "Santos, you'll be handling VIP service for the duration of the Pentagon delegation's visit," he'd said without looking up from his paperwork. "Make sure you understand what that means." Maria had understood perfectly. It meant being reduced to a waitress despite her 8 years of exemplary service, her 2 deployments to Afghanistan, and her spotless record. It meant smiling politely while generals twice her age treated her like furniture. It meant swallowing her pride and pretending that serving soup was somehow an honor. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just 18 months ago, she'd been leading a convoy through the most dangerous roads in Helmand Province. Her quick thinking and tactical expertise had saved 12 lives during an ambush that should have killed them all. The memory of that day still haunted her dreams, but it had also earned her something precious: recognition for her courage under fire. Now, as she ladled the evening's special onto bone china plates, Maria caught fragments of conversation from the table of visiting brass. General Morrison, a bear of a man with silver hair and intense blue eyes, was discussing troop readiness with his aide. General Patterson, younger but equally decorated, nodded along while reviewing documents that Maria couldn't see but suspected dealt with budget allocations. "The problem," General Morrison was saying, "is that we're not utilizing our human resources effectively. Too many good soldiers are being wasted in administrative roles when they should be in leadership positions." Maria bit her tongue as she set his plate down. If only he knew how ironic his words were in this moment. She'd graduated top of her class from the Non-Commissioned Officer Academy. Her supervisors in Afghanistan had recommended her for officer candidate school 3 times. Yet here she was, being used as decoration for a dinner party. Colonel Harrison watched from across the room, his expression unreadable but his message clear. This assignment wasn't about hospitality, it was about putting her in her place. Maria had made the mistake of questioning his decision to pass over qualified female soldiers for a recent training opportunity. She'd done it respectfully, through proper channels, but Harrison had a long memory for perceived slights. As she moved to serve the next course, Maria noticed General Patterson studying her with curious eyes. There was something different in his expression, not the dismissive glance she'd grown accustomed to, but genuine interest. When she reached his place at the table, he spoke quietly. "Excuse me, Sergeant, have we met before?" Maria straightened slightly. "No, sir, I don't believe so." He continued to study her face. "You remind me of someone. What's your background?" Before Maria could answer, Colonel Harrison appeared at her shoulder. "General Patterson, Sergeant Santos is one of our administrative personnel. She's been assigned to ensure your comfort during your visit." The dismissal in Harrison's voice was unmistakable, and Maria felt her jaw tighten. Administrative personnel. As if her combat experience meant nothing. As if the lives she'd saved were just paperwork filed away and forgotten. "I see," General Patterson said slowly, though his tone suggested he didn't see at all. "Well, she's doing an excellent job." The evening continued with painful predictability. Maria served course after course, refilled water glasses, and endured the casual dismissal that came with being treated as staff rather than soldier. The generals discussed strategy, shared war stories, and debated policy while she moved like a ghost among them. It was during the dessert service that things began to shift. General Morrison had launched into a detailed account of his time in Iraq, describing a particularly harrowing firefight that had earned him a Bronze Star. As he spoke, Maria found herself mentally comparing his description to her own experiences in Afghanistan. The tactics he described were outdated, the kind that would have gotten people killed in the asymmetric warfare she'd faced. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice General Patterson watching her again. This time, his scrutiny was more intense, more focused. When their eyes met across the table, she saw something that made her pulse quicken: recognition. "Sergeant," he said suddenly, causing a lull in the dinner conversation, "could you come here for a moment?" Maria approached carefully, aware that every eye in the room was now on her. Colonel Harrison's expression had shifted from smug satisfaction to barely concealed alarm. Whatever General Patterson wanted, it wasn't part of the evening's script. "Turn around," the general said quietly. The request was so unexpected that Maria hesitated. "Sir." "You're back, turn around, please." Confused but trained to follow orders, Maria executed a perfect about-face. She heard sharp intakes of breath from around the table, followed by complete silence. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of dishes from the enlisted mess hall next door. "Gentlemen," General Patterson said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward, "do you see what I see?" Maria remained at attention, her mind racing to understand what had just happened. She couldn't see the reactions around the table, but she could feel the sudden tension in the room like electricity before a storm. "My God," whispered General Morrison, "is that what I think it is?" "It is indeed," General Patterson replied. "Sergeant Santos, you may turn around." When Maria faced the table again, every expression had changed. The casual dismissal was gone, replaced by something she hadn't seen directed at her in months: respect. Even Colonel Harrison looked pale, as if he'd suddenly realized he'd made a terrible mistake. "Sergeant," General Patterson continued, "would you mind telling us about your service record?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maria glanced at Colonel Harrison, who gave the slightest nod, though his face had gone ashen. She squared her shoulders and began to speak, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. 8 years active duty, sir. 2 deployments to Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne, squad leader for 18 months in Helmand Province. She paused, unsure how much detail to provide. "Go on," General Morrison encouraged, his earlier bombast replaced by genuine interest. "I led convoy security operations and coordinated with local forces on intelligence-gathering missions. My squad was responsible for securing supply routes through some of the most contested areas in the province." What she didn't say, what she couldn't bring herself to say in front of Colonel Harrison, was that those missions had been hell. That she'd lost good soldiers to IEDs and sniper fire. That she'd held dying men in her arms and made split-second decisions that meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. General Patterson leaned forward. "Tell them about March 15th, 2023. The date hit Maria like a physical blow. She'd never spoken about that day to anyone outside the investigation. The official report was classified, and she'd been ordered not to discuss it publicly. But here was a general who somehow knew the details, asking her to share them in front of a room full of high-ranking officers. "Sir, I'm not sure I'm authorized to." "You are," General Patterson cut her off gently. "I was part of the review board. I read your full report. These gentlemen have the appropriate clearance." Maria's mind reeled. General Patterson had been on the review board. She tried to remember the faces from that long, grueling day of questions and testimony, but the whole experience had been a blur of fluorescent lights and stern expressions. "March 15th was a routine supply run," she began, her voice growing stronger as she fell into the familiar rhythm of an after-action report. 6 vehicles, standard escort protocol. We were returning from forward operating base Shepherd when our convoy came under coordinated attack." The room was absolutely silent now. Even the waitstaff who had been clearing dishes from the other tables had stopped to listen. Maria felt herself transported back to that dusty road in Afghanistan, the smell of diesel fuel and desert sand, the weight of her gear, the radio chatter that had suddenly gone silent. The lead vehicle hit an IED approximately 2 clicks from base. The explosion disabled the truck and trapped 4 soldiers inside. Simultaneously, we began taking fire from elevated positions on both sides of the road. She could see it all again, the smoke billowing from the wreckage, the flash of muzzle fire from the rocky outcroppings, the look of terror in young Private Johnson's eyes as he realized they were surrounded. "I ordered the convoy to establish a defensive perimeter while I assessed the situation. The attackers had chosen their position well. We were in a natural kill zone with limited cover and no clear escape route." General Morrison leaned forward. "How many hostiles?" "Intelligence later estimated between 15 and 20 fighters, sir. They had machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Classic L-shaped ambush." Maria had studied those tactics in training, but experiencing them firsthand was entirely different. The disciplined coordination of the attack had told her immediately that these weren't amateur fighters. They were experienced insurgents who had planned this ambush carefully. "What was your assessment of the situation?" General Patterson asked, though from his expression Maria suspected he already knew the answer. "Sir, the tactical situation was untenable. Standard protocol would have been to radio for air support and wait for extraction. But the soldiers in the lead vehicle were trapped and taking fire. They wouldn't have survived long enough for help to arrive." The memory of that moment still gave her chills. She'd been faced with an impossible choice: follow protocol and watch good soldiers die, or take an enormous risk that might save them all, or get everyone killed. "So what did you do?" Colonel Harrison asked quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since the questioning began, and his voice carried none of its usual authority. "I made the decision to assault the machine gun positions," Maria said simply. The words didn't capture the weight of that moment. The brief radio conversation with her team leaders, the look that passed between her and Sergeant Williams, her most experienced soldier. They'd all known it was likely a one-way mission. General Patterson nodded slowly. "Continue." "I took Corporal Martinez and Sergeant Williams with me. We used smoke grenades to mask our approach and moved up the eastern slope under covering fire from the rest of the squad. The plan was to neutralize the machine gun nest that had the best angle on the trapped vehicle." What followed had been 7 minutes of the most intense combat of Maria's military career. They'd moved through terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat, all while bullets whispered past their heads and mortar rounds shook the ground beneath their feet. The machine gun nest had been manned by 3 fighters who had clearly not expected a direct assault. Maria and her team had caught them in the middle of reloading, giving them the precious seconds they needed to close the distance. The fight had been brutal and close quarters, decided by training, determination, and a healthy dose of luck. After we neutralized the primary threat, we were able to establish an overwatch position that allowed the rest of the squad to safely extract the trapped soldiers, Maria concluded. She'd left out the details: the hand-to-hand combat, the moment when Martinez had taken a bullet in the shoulder, the way Sergeant Williams had continued fighting even after taking shrapnel in his leg. She'd left out the part where she'd had to make split-second decisions about which targets to engage first, decisions that had meant the difference between success and catastrophe. The room remained silent for a long moment after she finished. Finally, General Morrison spoke. "Sergeant Santos, that was remarkable tactical leadership under extreme pressure. Your actions saved the lives of your entire squad." Maria nodded stiffly. "Just doing my job, sir." "No," General Patterson said firmly. "You were doing far more than your job, which is why I was honored to recommend you for the Silver Star." The words hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Around the table, Maria could see the shock registering on every face. Colonel Harrison looked like he'd been struck by lightning. The Silver Star, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat, an award that recognized gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. An award that fewer than 1% of soldiers ever received. An award that Maria wore on her dress uniform every single day, pinned just below her left shoulder blade where it couldn't be seen from the front, where Colonel Harrison had apparently never bothered to look, where it had remained hidden while he'd assigned her to serve dinner like a common waitress. Until now. The silence that followed General Patterson's revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Maria stood at attention, her heart pounding as she watched the transformation ripple across the faces around the table. These weren't just any officers. They were some of the most senior leaders in the United States Army, and she could see each of them processing what they'd just learned. General Morrison recovered first, his weathered features shifting from surprise to something approaching awe. "Sergeant Santos," he said slowly, "would you mind if I asked to see your decoration?" The request was unprecedented. Maria had never been asked to display her medals outside of formal ceremonies, but she understood that this was no ordinary moment. She glanced at Colonel Harrison, whose face had gone from pale to distinctly green. "Sir, if you'd like to verify—" "That won't be necessary," General Patterson interrupted smoothly. "I remember the ceremony quite well. Fort Campbell, wasn't it? October 2023. "Yes, sir." Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. The ceremony had been small, attended only by her immediate family and unit members. She'd never imagined that one of the reviewing generals would remember her specifically. General Patterson turned to address the room, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen real combat and recognized it in others. "Gentlemen, what we have here is a perfect example of the leadership crisis we've been discussing all week. Sergeant Santos doesn't just hold the Silver Star. She earned it through the kind of tactical brilliance and personal courage that we desperately need in our officer corps." Colonel Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "General Patterson, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Morrison cut him off, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Because you never bothered to look beyond your own prejudices to see what was right in front of you." The rebuke hit Colonel Harrison like a physical blow. Maria had never seen him look so small, so diminished. For months, he'd strutted around the base like he owned it, making decisions based on personal preferences rather than merit. Now, faced with generals who outranked him by several levels, his true nature was showing. "Sir," Harrison stammered, "Sergeant Santos has been assigned to administrative duties because—" "Because you're an idiot," General Morrison said flatly. The blunt assessment sent shocked murmurs around the table. It was one thing to criticize a subordinate's decisions. It was quite another for a general to call a colonel an idiot to his face in front of other officers. Maria felt a surge of vindication mixed with alarm. While it was satisfying to see Harrison taken down a peg, she also knew that military politics could be treacherous. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would have lasting consequences for everyone in the room. General Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Harrison with the detached interest of an entomologist examining a particularly unpleasant insect. "Colonel, help me understand something. You have a Silver Star recipient in your command, someone who has proven herself under the most extreme combat conditions imaginable, and your best use for her talents is serving dinner." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Harrison's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "General, there may have been some miscommunication about Sergeant Santos's background. I'll certainly review her file and—" "Miscommunication," Morrison's voice rose dangerously. "Son, are you telling me you don't know the service records of your own people?" Maria watched the exchange with fascination and growing concern. She'd wanted recognition, yes, but she hadn't wanted to destroy anyone's career in the process. Even Harrison, for all his faults, was still a fellow soldier. The military was a small world, and making enemies could have serious consequences down the line. But as she looked around the table, she realized that the damage was already done. The other officers present, a mix of colonels and brigadier generals, were watching Harrison with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. Word of this dinner would spread through the Pentagon within hours. Harrison's career was effectively over. "Sergeant Santos," General Patterson said, turning back to her with a completely different tone, "I'd like to hear more about your current duties. What exactly has your role been since returning from deployment?" It was a loaded question, and Maria knew it. How she answered could determine not just her own future, but potentially Harrison's as well. She chose her words carefully. "Sir, I've been assigned to various administrative and logistical functions. Training coordination, personnel management, some ceremonial duties." "Ceremonial duties like tonight?" Morrison asked pointedly. "Among others, yes, sir." "And what about leadership opportunities, training positions, career development?" Maria hesitated. The truth was that she'd been systematically excluded from every meaningful assignment since her return. While her male counterparts were being given platoon leader positions and sent to advanced training courses, she'd been relegated to filing paperwork and organizing social events. "I believe Colonel Harrison would be better positioned to discuss assignment protocols," she said diplomatically. It was a careful non-answer, but the generals weren't fooled. General Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly, and Maria could see him filing away the information for later use. "Colonel Harrison," Patterson said without taking his eyes off Maria, "I'd like to see Sergeant Santos's efficiency reports for the past 18 months. "Sir, those documents are—" "I'm not asking, Colonel. I'm giving you an order." The steel in Patterson's voice made it clear that this was no longer a polite dinner conversation. This was an official inquiry, and Harrison was rapidly running out of room to maneuver. "Of course, sir. I'll have my aide retrieve them immediately." As Harrison fumbled for his phone to make the call, Maria found herself at the center of attention once again. But this time, the scrutiny felt different. Instead of being examined like a curiosity, she was being evaluated like a potential asset. "Sergeant," Morrison said gently, "while we wait for those documents, would you mind sharing your thoughts on the current state of NCO leadership development in the Army?" It was a test, Maria realized. They wanted to see if her tactical brilliance extended to broader strategic thinking. The question was complex enough to reveal her depth of knowledge while specific enough to demonstrate her experience. "Sir, I believe we're facing a critical shortage of combat-experienced leaders at the squad and platoon level. Many of our best NCOs are being promoted out of direct leadership roles before they can pass on their knowledge to the next generation." She paused, considering how far to push. "Additionally, I think we may be overlooking qualified candidates for leadership positions based on factors that aren't relevant to their ability to lead soldiers in combat." It was as close as she dared come to criticizing the systematic discrimination she'd experienced, without directly accusing her chain of command. General Patterson smiled slightly. "Interesting perspective. Can you elaborate on that second point?" Now she was in dangerous territory. Criticizing military culture in front of senior leaders was a career-limiting move under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Maria sensed that honesty might be more valuable than diplomacy. "Sir, I've observed that sometimes the most qualified person for a position isn't selected because they don't fit certain preconceived notions about what a leader should look like. Combat effectiveness doesn't always correlate with traditional leadership stereotypes." "You mean like the stereotype that combat heroes should be serving dinner instead of leading soldiers?" Morrison asked with a wry smile. "That's one example, yes, sir." The admission sent another ripple of tension through the room. Colonel Harrison's aide had arrived with a stack of files, but no one was paying attention to him anymore. All eyes were on Maria as she navigated the treacherous waters of military politics with the same skill she'd shown in combat. General Patterson accepted the files from Harrison's aide and began flipping through them immediately. His expression grew darker with each page. "This is fascinating reading, Colonel," he said after several minutes. "According to these reports, Sergeant Santos is rated as meets standards in leadership and needs improvement in tactical knowledge." The room erupted in disbelief. Several officers actually laughed out loud at the absurdity of the ratings. A Silver Star recipient who needs improvement in tactical knowledge was like saying Einstein needed remedial math. "Sir," Harrison began desperately, "those ratings were based on—" "On what?" Morrison demanded. "On your personal assessment that a decorated combat veteran who saved the lives of her entire squad lacks tactical knowledge. Please, enlighten us about your reasoning." Maria watched Harrison squirm with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. She'd known her efficiency reports were unfairly negative, but seeing the general's reaction drove home just how egregious the ratings had been. "Perhaps," General Patterson said smoothly, "we should focus on the future rather than dwelling on past mistakes. Sergeant Santos, what are your career goals?" The question caught her off guard. For months, she'd been so focused on surviving each day's assignments and maintaining her sanity that she'd almost stopped thinking about her future in the military. "Sir, I'd like to continue serving in positions where I can make a meaningful contribution to the mission and help develop the next generation of soldiers." "Any interest in becoming an officer?" The question she'd been waiting for, the opportunity she'd been denied repeatedly by Harrison and others like him. She straightened unconsciously. "Yes, sir, very much so." "Excellent, Colonel Harrison. I trust you've already initiated the paperwork for Sergeant Santos to attend Officer Candidate School." Harrison looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Sir, that is, we haven't. The process is quite competitive." "Indeed it is," Patterson agreed pleasantly. "Which is why it's perfect for someone with Sergeant Santos's qualifications. I'm sure you'll expedite her application immediately." It wasn't really a suggestion, and everyone in the room knew it. Harrison nodded numbly. "Furthermore," Morrison added, "I think it would be beneficial for Sergeant Santos to spend some time in a more challenging assignment while her OCS application is being processed. Something that would better utilize her combat experience and leadership abilities." "What did you have in mind, sir?" Harrison asked, though he looked like he was afraid to hear the answer. I believe there's an opening for a senior NCO instructor at the Ranger School. Someone with real combat experience who can teach the next generation of leaders what it actually takes to survive and succeed in battle. Maria's heart jumped. The Ranger School was one of the most prestigious assignments in the Army. Infantry officers and NCOs competed fiercely for instructor positions there. It was exactly the kind of career-enhancing assignment she'd been hopping for. That sounds like an excellent fit, Patterson agreed. Of course, such a position would require immediate transfer from her current assignment. The implications were clear. Not only would Maria be rescued from her current situation, but Harrison would lose one of his most qualified soldiers due to his own poor judgment. It was a masterclass in how senior leaders could reshape careers with a few well-placed words. As the evening wound down, Maria found herself in a completely different position than she'd occupied just hours earlier. Instead of being dismissed as administrative staff, she was being treated as a valued asset. Instead of serving dinner to generals, she was being offered opportunities that could transform her career. But as she prepared to leave the dining room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The recognition was gratifying, but it also came with new challenges and expectations. The real test would be proving that she deserved not just the opportunities being offered, but all the ones she'd been denied along the way. 3 weeks later, Maria stood at the edge of Camp Darby's main training area, watching a group of officer candidates struggle through their first combat simulation exercise. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on the pine-dotted landscape as she observed their tactics through binoculars, making mental notes about their strengths and weaknesses. The transfer to Ranger School had happened with stunning speed. Within days of the dinner incident, she'd received orders cutting her loose from Fort Braxton and assigning her to the Ranger Training Brigade as a senior instructor. Colonel Harrison had signed the paperwork without comment, though rumors suggested he'd be retiring earlier than originally planned. "What's your assessment, Sergeant Santos?" asked Major Blake, the course director who had become her immediate supervisor. Blake was a combat veteran himself, having served 3 tours in Iraq, and he'd made it clear from day one that he respected Maria's experience. "Sir, they're thinking like staff officers instead of combat leaders," Maria replied, lowering her binoculars. "They're trying to coordinate complex maneuvers when the situation calls for simple, aggressive action." Below them, the officer candidates were indeed overthinking the problem. Faced with a simulated enemy position that could have been overrun with a straightforward assault, they were attempting an elaborate flanking maneuver that was taking too long and exposing them to unnecessary casualties. "Agreed, want to go down there and show them how it's done." Maria grinned. This was what she'd been waiting for, the chance to actually teach instead of just serving coffee and filing reports. "Yes, sir." The descent into the training area took only a few minutes, but it transported Maria into a completely different world. Here, rank mattered less than competence. Results spoke louder than politics. It was a meritocracy in the truest sense, where performance under pressure determined standing. "Halt," Maria called out as she approached the group of sweating, frustrated officer candidates. "Gather around." The response was immediate. Despite her relatively junior rank, the candidates recognized her authority instantly. Word of her background had spread quickly through the Ranger community, and stories of her Afghan exploits had grown in the telling. "What I'm seeing here is a classic case of overthinking," she began, studying the faces around her. The group was diverse, men and women from various branches of the military, all united by their desire to earn the coveted Ranger tab. Sometimes the best tactical solution is the simplest one. She turned to point at the mock enemy position. "You've identified the threat. You've assessed your available resources. Now you need to act. In combat, speed and decisiveness often matter more than perfect planning." Lieutenant Rodriguez, a young infantry officer from Fort Stewart, raised his hand. "Sergeant Santos, our instructors have always emphasized the importance of detailed planning before any operation." "And they're right," Maria acknowledged. "But there's a difference between planning and paralysis. In Afghanistan, I learned that sometimes you have to make decisions with incomplete information and trust your training to see you through." She gestured for the group to follow her to a better vantage point. "Let me tell you about a situation where overthinking almost got good soldiers killed." The candidates gathered closer, their earlier frustration replaced by genuine interest. Maria had discovered that she had a gift for teaching, the ability to take complex tactical concepts and make them understandable through real-world examples. We were escorting a supply convoy through the Sangin district. Intelligence suggested possible IED activity along our route, but we had to get medical supplies to a forward operating base before nightfall. She paused, letting the scenario sink in. Standard procedure would have been to call for an EOD team and wait for clearance, but soldiers were dying while we sat there analyzing the threat. Lieutenant Chen, an engineer officer who had been particularly vocal about proper procedures, spoke up. "So what did you do?" "I made a calculated risk assessment. We couldn't afford to wait, but we also couldn't ignore the threat. So I ordered the convoy to take an alternate route that was longer but less likely to be mined. It added 2 hours to our journey, but it got those medical supplies where they needed to be." "That sounds like good planning to me," Rodriguez observed. It was, but the key was making the decision quickly based on available information rather than waiting for perfect intelligence that might never come. Maria looked around the circle. "The same principle applies here. You've been starring at that position for 20 minutes. In a real firefight, 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. She pointed back toward the objective. "What's the fastest way to neutralize that threat?" "Direct assault," several voices replied simultaneously. "Exactly. Sometimes the obvious answer is the right answer. Your job as leaders isn't to impress people with clever tactics. It's to accomplish the mission with minimum casualties." The lesson that followed was a revelation for both the candidates and Maria herself. She found that her combat experience translated perfectly into teaching scenarios. The theoretical knowledge she'd gained through years of military education combined with hard-earned practical wisdom to create instruction that was both technically sound and viscerally real. As the weeks passed, Maria's reputation as an instructor grew. Her classes consistently received the highest evaluation scores, and candidates specifically requested assignment to her training rotations. More importantly, she began to see improvement in the quality of officers being graduated from the program. The change in her own status was equally dramatic. Instead of being marginalized and dismissed, she found herself consulted on curriculum development and training methodology. Her opinions carried weight in staff meetings, and her suggestions were implemented without question. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time in months, Maria felt like she was making a meaningful contribution to something larger than herself. Every officer candidate who passed through her program would go on to lead soldiers in combat. The lessons she taught might someday save lives in real firefights. The validation came from unexpected sources. General Morrison visited the school 6 weeks after the dinner incident, ostensibly for a routine inspection, but really to check on Maria's progress. She demonstrated a combat patrol exercise for him, narrating the tactical decisions as a mixed group of Army and Marine officers worked through a simulated ambush scenario. "Outstanding," Morrison commented as the exercise concluded. "Your students showed exactly the kind of aggressive leadership we need in the field." "Thank you, sir. They're good students. They just needed to learn to trust their instincts." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Speaking of trusting instincts, I have some news about your OCS application." Maria's heart skipped. She'd submitted the paperwork weeks ago but hadn't heard anything back. In the military bureaucracy, silence could mean anything from under review to lost in the system. "You've been accepted," Morrison said with a slight smile. "In fact, you've been accepted to the accelerated program for prior service candidates. You'll commission as a second lieutenant in 8 months instead of the usual 12. The news hit her like a thunderbolt. Officer candidate school. The goal she'd been working toward for years, denied repeatedly by Harrison and others like him, was finally within reach. "Sir, thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. Thank yourself. Your performance here has been exemplary, and your student evaluations are some of the best we've ever seen. You've proven that recognizing talent is more important than perpetuating prejudices." That evening, Maria called her family to share the news. Her mother cried. Her father, a retired police officer who understood the importance of recognition, simply said, "About damn time." Her younger brother, currently serving as a Marine corporal, whooped so loudly that half the barracks probably heard him. But the conversation that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Williams, her former squad member who had been wounded during the ambush that earned her the Silver Star, called from his new assignment in Germany. "Santos, you magnificent bastard," he said without preamble. "I heard about the general thing and now this OCS news. I'm so proud I might cry." "Williams, you big softy, how's the leg?" "Perfect, no permanent damage, thanks to someone who had the guts to make hard decisions under fire." His voice grew serious. "Maria, what happened at that dinner? That wasn't just about you getting recognition. That was about the Army finally starting to figure out that talent comes in all packages." It was true, she realized. Her story had become something larger than one person's career advancement. Word of the dinner incident had spread throughout the military community, sparking conversations about how talent was identified and nurtured. Several other female soldiers had reached out to share their own stories of being underutilized despite strong performance records. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent months being told she wasn't leadership material, only to discover that she was a natural teacher and mentor. The skills that made her effective in combat, quick decision-making, clear communication, the ability to inspire confidence under pressure, translated perfectly into instruction. As she prepared for the next phase of her career, Maria reflected on how dramatically things had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been serving soup to generals who didn't know her name. Now she was preparing to become an officer herself, with the recommendation of those same generals. But the most important change wasn't in her circumstances. It was in her understanding of what leadership really meant. It wasn't about rank or recognition or proving herself to people who had already made up their minds. It was about serving something larger than herself and helping others reach their potential. The Ranger School assignment had given her that opportunity. Every day, she worked with motivated officers who wanted to excel, who respected competence over politics, who judged her by her contributions rather than their preconceptions. And in 8 months, she would join their ranks as a commissioned officer, ready to take on even greater responsibilities. The journey from dinner service to officer candidate had been shorter than she'd ever imagined possible, but it had taught her lessons that would serve her well in the challenges ahead. The Army was changing, slowly but surely. People like General Morrison and General Patterson were making sure that talent was recognized regardless of what package it came in. And Maria Santos, former server of generals' dinners, future leader of soldiers, was proof that the system could work when the right people were paying attention. 8 months at officer candidate school passed in a blur of rigorous training, academic study, and leadership challenges that pushed Maria to her limits. She graduated second in her class, earning her commission as a second lieutenant along with the respect of instructors who had initially been skeptical about her unconventional path to leadership. The day she pinned on her gold bars, General Patterson was there to administer the oath of office. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about how seriously the senior leadership was taking her career development. "I've been following your progress, Lieutenant Santos," Patterson said after the ceremony. "Your instructors tell me you've shown exceptional aptitude for leadership development. That's exactly what we need in our officer corps." "Thank you, sir. I'm ready for whatever assignment comes next." Patterson smiled knowingly. "About that, I have some interesting news. You're being assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment as a platoon leader." Maria felt her breath catch. The 75th Ranger Regiment was the Army's premier direct action unit, composed entirely of volunteers who had passed the most rigorous selection and training processes in the military. It was an assignment that most officers spent years working toward. "Sir, I'm honored, but I should mention that I haven't attended Ranger School yet. The assignment while I was an instructor has been taken care of," Patterson interrupted. "Your performance as an instructor demonstrated that you already possess the tactical knowledge and leadership skills the school is designed to teach. The regimental commander has agreed to waive the requirement based on your combat record and instructor evaluations." It was unprecedented. The Ranger tab was so fundamental to serving in the regiment that Maria couldn't think of a single officer who had been assigned there without it. Yet here she was, being offered a position based purely on demonstrated competence. "Sir, won't that cause problems with my soldiers? They'll expect their platoon leader to have graduated Ranger School." "Lieutenant, your soldiers will expect their platoon leader to be able to lead them effectively in combat. Everything else is just decoration." Patterson's expression grew serious. Besides, I think you'll find that your reputation precedes you. He was right, as Maria discovered when she reported to the regiment's headquarters at Fort Benning 2 weeks later. The story of the dinner incident had become legendary within the special operations community. Rather than being seen as an outsider, she was welcomed as someone who had proven herself under the most challenging conditions. First Sergeant Mike Torres, a grizzled veteran with 20 years in the regiment, summed up the unit's attitude during her initial briefing. "Ma'am, we don't care what schools you've been to or what tabs you're wearing. We care whether you can make good decisions when people are shooting at us. Word is you can." Her platoon consisted of 36 Rangers, all of them volunteers who had passed the regiment's grueling selection process. They were young, aggressive, and supremely confident, exactly the kind of soldiers who could detect weakness or incompetence instantly. The first test came during a live-fire training exercise 3 days after her arrival. The scenario was complex, a simulated hostage rescue that required precise coordination between multiple teams operating in a dense urban environment. As the platoon leader, Maria was responsible for overall tactical command, while her squad leaders executed the specific mission elements. Standing in the observation tower, she watched her Rangers move through the kill house with practiced efficiency. Each movement was deliberate, each shot precisely placed. But as the exercise progressed, she noticed a problem that the other observers had missed. "Second squad is moving too fast," she told the exercise controller, a major who was responsible for evaluating the training. "They're going to arrive at the objective before first squad is in position to provide overwatch." The major checked his timeline. "They're actually ahead of schedule, Lieutenant. That's generally considered a good thing." "Not in this case, sir. Look at the angles." Maria pointed to the tactical display showing the relative positions of her squads. Second squad was indeed making excellent time, but their rapid advance was creating a gap that would expose them to simulated enemy fire from a concealed position. If they continue at that pace, they'll walk into a crossfire between buildings 3 and 4. First squad won't be able to provide cover because they'll still be moving into position. The major studied the display more carefully, then nodded grimly. "You're right. Should we halt the exercise?" "No, sir. Let me handle it." Maria keyed her radio. "Second squad, this is actual. Slow your advance and hold position at checkpoint Charlie until first squad confirms overwatch." The response came back immediately. "Actual, this is 2-6. We're ahead of timeline and have clear approach to objective. Request permission to continue." It was the kind of moment that defined leadership. Her squad leader was technically correct. They were ahead of schedule and the approach looked clear. But Maria could see the tactical picture that he couldn't from ground level. "-2-6, hold position, that's an order." There was a brief pause before the acknowledgement came back. "Roger, actual, holding position." 2 minutes later, first squad reported ready from their overwatch position. Second squad resumed their advance and completed the objective without casualties. During the after-action review, the exercise controllers confirmed that Maria's intervention had prevented what would have been a catastrophic ambush in a real operation. "Outstanding tactical awareness," the major commented. "Your ability to see the bigger picture while maintaining situational awareness at the squad level is exactly what we look for in Ranger leaders." But more important than the official evaluation was the reaction of her soldiers. After the exercise, Sergeant First Class Jackson, her most experienced squad leader, approached her privately. "Ma'am, that was good work back there. You saved second squad from walking into a meat grinder." "Just doing my job, Sergeant." Jackson smiled. "Yes, ma'am, but you did it right. The guys are starting to understand why the brass thinks so highly of you." Over the following weeks, Maria threw herself into the demanding routine of Ranger training. The physical requirements were brutal: long-range patrols carrying heavy packs, live-fire exercises that lasted for days, and scenarios designed to test decision-making under extreme fatigue and stress. But it was the mental challenges that truly distinguished Ranger training from conventional military exercises. Every mission was designed to force leaders to make difficult choices with incomplete information, while managing the competing demands of speed, security, and surprise. Maria found herself thriving in this environment. Her combat experience in Afghanistan had prepared her for the chaos and uncertainty that characterized Ranger operations. More importantly, Her time as an instructor had taught her how to communicate complex tactical concepts quickly and clearly. The breakthrough moment came during a particularly challenging exercise in the mountains of northern Georgia. Her platoon had been tasked with infiltrating behind enemy lines to gather intelligence on a high-value target. The mission required a 20-mile approach march, followed by a complex surveillance operation that would test both their physical endurance and tactical patience. Everything went wrong from the beginning. Heavy rain turned the mountain trails into muddy quagmires. Navigation became difficult when fog reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. Worse, intelligence reports indicated that the enemy had increased patrols in their area of operations. By the third day, Maria's platoon was exhausted, behind schedule, and facing a decision point that would determine the success or failure of the entire mission. They could push forward despite the risks, potentially compromising their position. Or they could wait for better conditions, possibly missing their window of opportunity. It was exactly the kind of situation she'd faced countless times in Afghanistan, a moment when leadership mattered more than rank or credentials. "Gather the squad leaders," she told First Sergeant Tors. "We need to make a decision." The leadership huddle took place in a small clearing barely large enough for the 5 men to crouch together. Maria spread out her map and quickly outlined their situation. "We're 12 hours behind timeline due to weather. The target area will be crawling with patrols for the next 6 hours, but then they typically reduce activity during evening meals. We have 2 options: push forward now and risk compromise, or wait until tonight and risk missing our window." Sergeant Jackson studied the map. "Ma'am, if we wait until tonight, we'll only have 4 hours before we need to begin exfiltration. That's not much time for a detailed reconnaissance." "Agreed, but if we go now and get spotted, the mission fails completely." Maria looked around the circle. "What does everyone think?" It was a moment that demonstrated her evolution as a leader. The Maria who had served dinner to generals would have been afraid to show any uncertainty. The Maria who had earned her silver star would have made the decision alone and expected others to follow. But this Maria understood that good leadership often meant leveraging the collective wisdom of experienced subordinates. The discussion that followed was brief but thorough. Each squad leader contributed their assessment based on their specific area of expertise. Within 10 minutes, they had reached a consensus. "We wait," Maria decided. "The risk of compromise is too high, and 4 hours will be enough time if we're efficient. We'll move at 1800 hours and complete reconnaissance by 2200. The plan worked perfectly. Moving under cover of darkness, her rangers infiltrated the target area undetected and gathered the intelligence they needed. The exercise controllers later commented that it was one of the most professionally executed reconnaissance missions they'd ever observed. But more importantly, Maria had earned something that couldn't be taught in any school or gained through any amount of political maneuvering. She had earned the complete trust and confidence of her soldiers. The validation came during the final exercise evaluation, when Tors pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Ma'am, I've been in this regiment for 20 years. I've served under a lot of officers, some good, some not so good. But I've never seen soldiers respond to a new leader the way your guys have responded to you." "What do you mean?" "I mean they trust you completely. Not because of your rank or your decorations, but because you've proven you can make the right decisions when it matters. That's the rarest quality in military leadership." Tors was right, Maria realized. Trust wasn't something that could be demanded or assigned. It had to be earned through consistent demonstration of competence and character. And somehow, despite all the obstacles she'd faced, despite being assigned to serve dinner when she should have been leading soldiers, she had found her way to exactly where she belonged. As she prepared for her first deployment with the regiment, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Less than a year ago, she'd been invisible to the chain of command, her talents wasted and her potential ignored. Now she was preparing to lead some of the Army's most elite soldiers in the most challenging missions imaginable. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But it had proven something that she'd always believed but never been able to demonstrate: that true leadership wasn't about politics or connections or fitting into someone else's expectations. It was about competence, character, and the courage to make difficult decisions when lives were on the line. Everything else was just noise. 2 years later, Captain Maria Santos stood in the Pentagon briefing room where her military career had taken its most dramatic turn. But this time, she wasn't serving coffee or clearing plates. She was briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff on lessons learned from her platoon's recent deployment to Syria, where they had successfully conducted 17 high-value target missions without a single American casualty. The irony wasn't lost on her as she looked out at the same dining room where General Patterson had first spotted her Silver Star. The elegant space had been converted into a secure briefing facility, but she could still picture exactly where each general had been sitting that night when her world had changed forever. "Captain Santos," said General Morrison, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs, "your unit's performance in Syria has been exceptional. Walk us through your approach to urban reconnaissance operations." Maria activated the large screen display and began her presentation with the confidence of someone who had proven herself in the most challenging environments imaginable. The audience included not just the Joint Chiefs, but also senior commanders from Special Operations Command and key staff from the National Security Council. "Sir, our success in Syria stemmed from 3 key innovations," she began, clicking to her first slide. "Integrated human intelligence, adaptive tactical planning, and what we call micro-leadership at the team level." As she detailed her unit's methodology, Maria found herself drawing heavily on lessons that had nothing to do with formal military education. The patience she'd learned, while serving unwanted dinner assignments, had taught her to observe carefully and wait for the right moment. The humility forced on her by months of marginalization had shown her the value of listening to subordinates regardless of their rank. "The traditional approach to urban reconnaissance relies heavily on technical intelligence and predetermined routes," she continued. "Our experience showed that the most valuable intelligence often comes from cultural observation and human interaction. My Rangers learned to read the rhythm of civilian life, to identify anomalies that sophisticated sensors might miss." General Patricia Hayes, the first female service chief and someone Maria had come to regard as a mentor, leaned forward. "Can you give us a specific example?" "Certainly, ma'am. During our 5th mission, targeting a high-value individual in Aleppo, our technical intelligence indicated he was operating from a specific building complex. Standard procedure would have been to establish overwatch positions and wait for visual confirmation." Maria clicked to a detailed map of the target area. "But my point man, Specialist Rodriguez, noticed that the local bread vendor changed his route on certain days. When we investigated, we discovered the vendor was actually providing early warning to the target. By understanding that pattern, we were able to time our approach and successfully apprehend the individual without alerting his network." The presentation continued for 45 minutes, detailing innovations that had emerged from the practical experience of soldiers who understood that real combat rarely matched the scenarios taught in war colleges. Maria's Rangers had developed techniques for urban operations that were already being studied and adopted by special operations units throughout the military. When the formal briefing concluded, General Morrison approached her privately. "Maria, that was outstanding. Your unit's innovations are exactly the kind of adaptive thinking we need in modern warfare." "Thank you, sir. My Rangers deserve the credit. I just tried to create an environment where they felt comfortable sharing their insights." Morrison smiled. "That's leadership, Captain, and speaking of leadership, I have some news that might interest you." He handed her a folder marked with the seal of the Department of Defense. "You've been selected for the Command and General Staff College. After that, assuming you perform as well as I expect, you'll be looking at Battalion Command." Battalion Command, the goal that ambitious officers spent their entire careers working toward. Maria opened the folder and scanned the orders, hardly believing what she was reading. "Sir, this timeline puts me on track for Major in 18 months. That's extremely fast for someone with my background." "Your background is exactly why we're accelerating your career," Morrison replied. "The Army needs officers who understand both tactical excellence and adaptive leadership. Your journey from enlisted service to where you are now has given you perspectives that can't be taught in any school." As she left the Pentagon that evening, Maria's mind drifted back to that dinner service 2 years earlier. She remembered the humiliation of being treated as invisible, the frustration of having her capabilities dismissed, the anger at seeing her combat experience reduced to serving soup. But she also remembered the moment when everything changed, when General Patterson had noticed what Colonel Harrison had been too proud or too prejudiced to see. That single moment of recognition had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just her career, but her understanding of what leadership really meant. Her phone buzzed with a text message from First Sergeant Torres, now serving as the senior enlisted advisor for the entire Ranger Regiment. "Saw the news about your promotion track. Couldn't happen to a better officer. The regiment is proud of you." Similar messages poured in throughout the evening. Former students from her instructor days, Rangers she had led in Syria, even some of the officer candidates who had attended her classes at OCS. The network of professional relationships she had built through competence and character was now celebrating her success. The most meaningful message came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, now retired, had sent a brief email. "Captain Santos, I owe you an apology for my failure to recognize your potential earlier in your career. Your success is well-deserved and long overdue. I hope my mistakes have contributed to positive changes in how the Army identifies and develops talent." It was a gracious acknowledgement from someone who had cost himself a career through poor judgment. Maria appreciated the gesture, though she had long since moved past any anger about her treatment under his command. Life was too short, and the mission too important to waste energy on grudges. 3 months later, she reported to Fort Leavenworth for the Command and General Staff College, where she would spend a year studying advanced military strategy and operational planning, alongside other rising stars from across the armed forces. On her first day, she was approached by another student, Major Jennifer Kim, an Air Force officer whose own career had been marked by similar challenges with recognition and advancement. "You're Maria Santos, aren't you?" Kim asked during a break between orientation sessions. "I've heard your story. It's inspired a lot of us who have faced similar obstacles." "My story isn't that unique," Maria replied modestly. "Good soldiers overcoming prejudice is as old as the military itself." "Maybe, but your story has a different ending. Most of us just accept the limitations and work around them. You changed the system." It was true, Maria realized. The dinner incident had become more than just a personal career milestone. It had sparked conversations throughout the military about talent identification, equal opportunity, and the importance of looking beyond surface characteristics to recognize competence. General Patterson, now serving as the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff, had made Maria's case study required reading for senior commanders. The lesson wasn't just about avoiding discrimination. It was about creating systems that actively sought out and developed talent regardless of where it was found. The changes were measurable. Female officers were being assigned to combat leadership positions in record numbers. Non-traditional backgrounds were being viewed as assets rather than liabilities. Most importantly, the culture was shifting toward valuing demonstrated competence over conformity to established patterns. As Maria settled into her studies at Leavenworth, she found herself thinking about the future differently than she had as a young sergeant struggling for recognition. Her personal success was gratifying, but the broader impact was more significant. Every female soldier who saw her story understood that excellence would be recognized and rewarded. Every commander who read the case study was reminded that talent came in all forms, and that failure to recognize it was both wasteful and dangerous. The military was slowly but surely becoming what it had always claimed to be, a true meritocracy where performance mattered more than politics, where character counted more than connections, where the content of one's service record outweighed any preconceptions about what a leader should look like. Maria's Silver Star had been earned through courage under fire in Afghanistan, but her greatest contribution to the military would be the precedent she had established. That recognition delayed is not recognition denied. That talent will eventually find a way to surface, and that sometimes the most unlikely moments can become turning points that change everything. The dinner service that was meant to humiliate her had instead become the moment when the Army began to see itself more clearly. And Maria Santos, who had once been invisible to the very generals she served, had become impossible to ignore, not because of political maneuvering or systematic advocacy, but simply because she had been excellent at everything she was given the opportunity to do. As she began her advanced military education, Maria carried with her the lessons learned from every phase of her journey. The patience learned from serving unwanted assignments, the humility gained from being underestimated and overlooked, the confidence earned through proving herself repeatedly in the most challenging circumstances. But most importantly, she carried the understanding that true leadership wasn't about commanding respect. It was about earning it through consistent demonstration of competence, character, and commitment to something larger than oneself. The young woman who had once served dinner to generals would soon be commanding battalions and shaping the future of military leadership. And every soldier who served under her command would benefit from the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had learned that recognition, when it finally comes, is sweeter for having been delayed and more meaningful for having been truly earned.